this session, we have my colleague, Dr. Srinath Raghavan. To introduce him formally, may I request Dr. Anuradha Reddy she's the Deputy Director, DRDO, Delhi office, and she's also associated with Dr. Raghavan's school, International Strategic Studies. So she's also associated with various projects. So she would be the right person to introduce Dr. Srinath Raghavan and chair this session. Dr. Anuradha Reddy.
Good morning and a warm welcome to all my co-participants of the course at NIAS, Dr. Menon, Dr. Raghavan, ladies and gentlemen. In the last 4 days, we've had an opportunity to look into several dimensions associated with leadership. We've heard experts speak on conceptual parameters which attempt at defining leadership, challenges which leaders embrace to turn it into an advantage, ethical issues, and issues of governance. Compelling globalization, creating opportunities but demanding individuals, organizations, and nations to play leader. The attempt has been to work towards drawing a larger picture and understanding what is that which will make leadership credible, responsible, and which strives towards excellence. We have in our midst Dr. Srinath Raghavan this morning to address us on leadership and strategy. He will address the issue of leadership from the perspective of what are the compulsions operating on leadership of a nation when it is strategizing in situations of crisis and war. Dr. Raghavan looks into some major crisis situations which the world has witnessed in the last 150 years. This expose on leadership and strategy will help us to get an insight into how leaders make important decisions for nations. Dr. Raghavan is the right person to speak to us on this, as his research interests are international diplomatic history of post-colonial South Asia, India's military history, strategic theory, and civil-military relations. Dr. Raghavan has a book under publication titled Nehru's Wars and is also working on the history of Bangladesh's war. He is currently engaged in writing a conceptual project on strategies of coercion. Dr. Srinath has a PhD from King's College London and is an Associate Fellow at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Dr. Raghavan has also worked in the Indian Army before getting into the academic arena. May I welcome Dr. Raghavan to please address us on leadership and strategy.
What I want to really speak about is political leadership in times of war and crisis. This is not a talk about military leadership. I'm sure many of you who are sitting here are much more qualified than I am to speak on that issue. So what I want to really talk about today is what are the challenges which face political leaders during times of crises and war. And the way that I want to approach this topic is by beginning to look at some of the sort of major conceptual issues which are associated with wartime leadership. And then I'll go on to look at what I might call as 3 sort of short case studies of what leadership in war, successful leadership in war. I will begin by looking at Abraham Lincoln in the American Civil War, then go on to look at Winston Churchill in the Second World War, and finally consider Mrs. Indira Gandhi and the war for Bangladesh in 1971. So, to begin with, what is leadership? Leadership as an activity which encompasses a number of fields involves a certain set of core activities which I've tried to identify here. These involve setting directions and projecting aims for an organization to decide what it wants to do. It involves picking subordinates, choosing the right people who can deliver the results for you as the leader of an organization. It then involves monitoring performance. You need to constantly look at how people under you are executing your aims and designs and keep a check as you move along. And it also means that you need to handle external constituencies. There are a number of people outside your organization to whom you're responsible. If you're a business organization, you're responsible to your shareholders. If you're a governmental organization, you're responsible to the public, who will then decide whether to re-elect you or not. So these constituencies will always have to be handled. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, means inspiring your organization to achieve whatever goals that you have set out for them to achieve. So these, I think, are the sort of key attributes and tasks of leadership in any organization. But why do we want to study wartime leadership? What is it so special about wartime leadership? I think leadership during a time of war or crisis really is looking at leadership at one extreme of the spectrum. situations of war are those situations where the stakes are of an extremely high order and where the margins for error are of an extremely low order. So this creates a great degree of pressure on any organization to deliver, and wartime leadership calls for a certain degree of resources which transcend what you might see as day-to-day leadership. But nevertheless, when we look at wartime leadership at its extreme, clearly there are some lessons to be taken away for leadership in other walks of life as well. If you want to study the finest steel, it is best to start with the hottest furnace. Okay, now when I'm using the term strategy here, this is what I mean by it. It is the creative use of available means to achieve desired ends. So strategy is the link between means and ends. And in the sense in which I'm talking about, which is political leadership in wartime, it means using the available military means in order to achieve the desired or set out political objectives of a war or a crisis. Now, strategy is a term which is highly abused. In the world of today, the term strategy is used for covering everything, starting from nuclear war at one end to the selling of soap at the other. But I think this somewhat obscures the issues, because strategy is not just about long-term planning or looking 10 years ahead, which is the sort of time-bound definition of strategy, which is normally used, especially in business parlance. Strategy is much more than that. The essence of strategy is interdependent decision-making. The choices that you have to make as a strategic leader are always going to be based not just on what is it that you want to achieve and how you want to go about doing it, but also take into account what your opponents will try and do in order to thwart you from achieving your objectives. So it's a situation of interdependence. You always are acting and reacting to what an adversary will do. Now, this brings me to what is the purpose and nature of war. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian military thinker in the 19th century, said that the purpose of war is always to achieve political objectives. So war is essentially a strategic activity. But he also said that the nature of war is not to serve political objectives, but to serve itself. And what he meant by that was that when you get into war, you are not just trying to achieve your objectives, but you're trying to do so in a situation where your opponents are trying to defeat you as well, which means that there is always going to be a degree of reciprocal interaction, which is what characterizes strategic thinking in the time of war. Finally, two concepts which I think are important to take us as we move along to the case studies. The first is what, again, going back to Clausewitz, is called friction. Now, friction means that every activity in war looks very simple, but in the execution of it, it becomes very difficult. And this is because you are trying to coordinate an organization which is so huge and so multifarious and involves the simultaneous concerted action at so many different levels that even a small mistake can have ripple effects which will then prevent you from achieving what is it that you really want to do. Clausewitz said that, fighting a war is like walking through water. The medium will always impede your movement. It's an important point. The second issue is that of what he called the culminating point of victory. Now, the idea of culminating point of victory was that you might go ahead and win a war, you might achieve your objectives, but beyond a particular point in the conduct of every war or in the execution of every strategy, you will reach a point where you will start to have diminishing marginal returns, to use the term of economics, in the conduct of strategy. For instance, when Napoleon took his army into Russia in 1812, he managed to get through well enough for the first thing, but by the time he reached Moscow, he was so far ahead of his own supply lines, he was so far ahead of his own basis of support, that the Russians found it very difficult then to encircle and cut him off. So every strategy will require understanding that there is a particular point where you need to stop. If you go beyond that, the paradoxical logic of strategy will come into play. Okay, so getting on to the first case study itself. Leadership in wartime. Now, what do politicians and military leaders do in wartime? The sort of common understanding is that politicians will do the politics, they will set the aims, and the military will do the fighting. Now, this is a somewhat misleading perception of what wartime activity means, because when we say that war is an extension of politics, it means that political activity or political choices will govern activities at all levels, whether it is at the operational or at the tactical levels. This is especially true in an age which is driven by media, where even the smallest of actions are scrutinized by audiences well beyond the battlefield itself. Now, political leadership in times of war involves a set of activities which is not very dissimilar from what I flashed ahead. It involves the articulation of goals, identifying the strategic concept. How is it that you're going to use the military means to achieve the desired ends? You need to shape operational choices. You need to decide which battles have to be fought, where do they have to be fought, and how does it fit into a larger scheme of your strategy. It also involves deciding what is the nature of acceptable risk. Now, this assessment of risk is not something which military commanders can do it alone. It has to be done by the political leadership because every activity of war involves a certain risk, not just for the troops on the ground, but for the country itself. Finally, it involves managing external relations, very similar to what I spoke about earlier. And the last point is that wars, especially wars which stretch out over a period of time, involve reconstructing your own organization in order to achieve your objectives. And that is broadly true of any activity. Anybody who embarks on a major new strategic activity will have to think of how to reshape the organization which he is leading. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War. Lincoln's personal background, as was summed up by one of his secretaries, was that he was a rank amateur, somebody who had never fought a war. He was a lawyer by training and had served as a senator from Illinois before he came on to the national level politics. And his preparation for office was very limited because he had just done about 2 years in the Senate before he became the President of the United States. And the context in which Abraham Lincoln came to office was a highly explosive one. Now, what had happened essentially was that the United States of America, the Union, as the Northerners called themselves, which is the sort of blue states which is put there, and there were a group of southern states which called themselves the Confederate States of America, which supported the institution of slavery. And when Abraham Lincoln won the campaign of presidency on the grounds that he will not allow slavery to be extended to other states, the Confederate States declared themselves independent from the Union. So Abraham Lincoln came into a situation where a civil war was definitely going to happen, and America was fighting itself. Now, there is a particular point there called Fort Sumter. So just make a note of it because I'll come back to it. This is a place in the Confederate territory, but which was very crucial when the war began itself. So when Abraham Lincoln came to war, when he assumed office and when the Civil War began, he declared that his fundamental aim was the restoration of the Union. That is, there would be one United States of America, and the Confederacy would not be allowed to exist. Now, Abraham Lincoln was also clear that this aim would only be achieved on the condition that slavery could not be expanded beyond the states in which it existed in 1860. Now, if you look back to the map, what this meant was that the group of states which are here shown as the Confederates, here, now they had slavery as an institution, and Lincoln did not say that you need to do away with slavery there. What he was saying was that these new territories, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, etc., these new territories which were now becoming part of the United States, in those territories, slavery should not be permitted. So Lincoln's war aim was that slavery could not be expanded beyond the Confederate States. And finally, Lincoln was very clear from the minute he assumed office that if a war had to begin, it should begin with an act of aggression by the South or by the Confederate States, because that would let him get the moral high ground, the legitimacy in order to carry the war effort itself. And how did Lincoln think that he would go about doing it? What was his strategy? His strategy was that the Confederacy must be deprived of external support, particularly from Europe. And this was especially important because the Confederate States were the major cotton-growing states of America, and they were the sort of major source of export for the industrialized countries in Europe itself. Now, Abraham Lincoln decided that first thing was to cut off external support. The second thing was to achieve victory, the Union armed forces would have to crush the Confederate army. And the best way to do this was to mount a concerted offensive around the circumference of the South. This would enable the Union's material and numerical superiority to be brought to bear on the conflict. Now, what this meant was that Lincoln was not talking about capturing territory. He was not saying that we need to capture the Southern territory. He said the South is strong because of its army, and that army has to be destroyed. And the day that we destroy the army, the South will come to terms on the terms that we want them to come to. Yep. Okay, so the execution of strategy. Fort Sumter, that particular point which I said, had a northern garrison, had a garrison of the Union Army, and it was very much part of the Southern territories. Lincoln said that as the first act of war has to begin by the South, we will do a peaceful replenishment of that particular post. So he just sent in some boats in order to do that. The South took the bait, and they triggered the war. The Southern Army was led by one of the most distinguished military officers of the United States of America, Robert E. Lee, who had a group of subordinates who were simply the best military officers of any side. So the Southern Army as a professional force was a very strong one, in very sharp contrast to the Northern Army. And hence, it became very clear as the war progressed that destroying the enemy's armed forces, which is what Lincoln wanted to do, was not something which could be done very, very easily. And this became clear through a series of battles where the North actually took a number of beating. And only in 1864, which is 3 years into the war, did the northern armies get their act together and launch a mounted offensive. Now, one of the things which happened during the Civil War was that Lincoln's objectives, the aims with which he started out, began to change. And this happens because strategy is an interactive thing. You're constantly reacting to what the other side is doing as well. And Lincoln in 1860 said that if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do that. So Lincoln was not opposed to the system of slavery itself, only to the extension of that system to other territories. But by January 1863, about a year and a half into the war, Lincoln gave the famous Emancipation Proclamation, where he said that slaveholding was illegal in the United States of America. This is seen as a sort of a great movement, and Barack Obama, who recently took oath as American president, has been referring to it, and that's one of the reasons why he used the Lincoln Bible, because it was Lincoln who is known as the great emancipator. But this Emancipation Proclamation was not given on some sort of moral grounds. There was a strategic rationale to it. And the strategic rationale was that Lincoln wanted to enroll the blacks into the Union armies in larger numbers to fight against the South. So there was a requirement that this needed to be done because of the changing circumstances, because the war was not going the way he wanted it to go. There was another rationale as well, which was that he wanted to exploit the anti-slavery sentiment in Britain and France. Both countries had abolished slavery earlier in the century. And in order to prevent those countries from coming to the aid of the South, Lincoln wanted to abolish slavery. Now, as I said earlier, Lincoln's sort of objective was to destroy the South's will to fight by destroying its army, not the capture of territory. And this Lincoln found was very difficult, because a number of generals whom he had successively appointed to command the Union armies failed to deliver him that result. Most of them would either think of capturing territory or would not go ahead, and even if they won a particular battle, to destroy the armed forces, which meant that you need to have follow-up action and so on. Take a look at this. Irvin McDowell lasted as Lincoln's commander-in-chief for 5 months. George McClellan, 11 months. John Pope, 2 months. Ambrose Burnside, 3 months. George Meade, nominally for 2 years, but only for 9 months. And ultimately, in 1863, Lincoln found his general, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, the conduct of the war itself. One of the key things which Lincoln had to do was to deal with the subordinates. And as the list which I showed earlier said, that this was not something which was very easy for Lincoln to do, primarily because his subordinates were resisting his conception of what the strategy was. They did not believe that this was the way to go about doing this war. And he had to deal with a number of people who also had very strong views about what the political situation in the country should be. Here is a good example. Lincoln wrote a letter to Joseph Hooker, whom he had just appointed as the commander-in-chief of his army. And he said, "I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier. I have heard of your recently saying that we need a dictator," which is what Hooker had said. "Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better example of how to deal with a resourceful but tough subordinate. Here is Abraham Lincoln, who's got the right measure. He knows when to praise, he knows when to put a halt. That was something which was very important. It was all the more important when Lincoln came to handling General Ulysses S. Grant, the general who actually gave him the victories that he wanted. In today's parlance, Grant would be considered a certifiable alcoholic. He was one of those people who used to go into bouts of drinking, binge drinking, and then emerge completely sort of sloshed from them. And Lincoln realized that despite this sort of grave flaw which Grant had a number of good qualities as well. He was someone who understood Lincoln's conception of the war. He knew that he had to relentlessly press forward till such time the Union armies destroyed the Southern armies. And hence, Lincoln found a subordinate who was willing to go along, who was flawed, but he molded him as he went along. That was important. The other thing which Lincoln was very interested in was in military technology. He understood that the nature of war in the 1860s was changing. He would personally go to the firing range, test new weapons, speak to people who were developing them, had a very close and great interest in the actual detail of how the war was being fought. Now, this was also a period where the telegraph was first coming into use in the 1860s. And Lincoln, as one of his subordinates noted, almost lived in the telegraph office. He would go there, he would constantly be in touch with operations which are happening in the battle, constantly send out messages to his generals, take feedback from them, have a very close degree of watch over what was happening. And this is evident on an instruction which he gave to General Grant on 3rd March 1865, just a month and a half before the Civil War came to a close. He told, "Have no conference with General Lee," that's the general of the enemy side, unless it be for the capitulation of Lee's army. So that is a sort of close oversight which Lincoln was maintaining. And finally, Lincoln's perhaps most lasting contribution was the way he managed the domestic front, the way that he used his speeches, his language, in order to tell people that this was a war which was worth fighting for, and that the sacrifices which he was calling upon them to make were all worth making. Let us not forget that in the American Civil War, 600,000 Americans lost their lives. It's not a small number at all. And this was done primarily because Lincoln understood that as a leader, he had to be an educator. He had to tell people that these are sacrifices which were worth bearing because the cause was a noble one. Let me show you a recent cartoon about how Lincoln went through successive drafts of what is now known as the Gettysburg Address. This was one of the famous address, a very short one actually, but Lincoln worked on it for many days, and there are many versions of the draft which are available. But what this cartoon tells you is modern day attitudes towards political leadership, where we think that giving speeches is just speechifying. It is not. At least Lincoln did not see it that way. He saw it as a critical element of his own leadership. Okay, moving on now to Churchill and the Second World War. Now, Churchill's personal background was in many ways very different from that of Lincoln, primarily because Churchill was involved in the activity of war from the very outset. He was an officer in the British Army. He had served in this particular city, in Bangalore. The Bangalore Club has got an entry where Churchill is signed. And thereafter, he continued as a war correspondent. He went to the Sudan, where he was one of the earliest war correspondents of his times. He would write dispatches which were then sent back to British newspapers, and which was also the main source of income for him. Subsequently, he covered the Boer War in 1899-1901. And later, once he got back and entered politics, now Churchill very quickly rose up the ranks, and during the First World War, Churchill was the head of the Admiralty, in the sense that he was head of the Naval Department. He was not the chief of the Navy, he was head of the Naval Department. He was a politician who was in charge of the department. And there, as the head of the Admiralty, Churchill was involved in one of the greatest fiascos of the First World War. Now, Dardanelles is a place which is in Turkey. It's an inland sort of an operation. One of the things which Churchill pushed for was to carry out an amphibious assault on Dardanelles in order to give the Britain and the Allied forces a toehold into Turkish area. And Turkey was part of the other side in the First World War. The operation went completely awry. There were huge casualties. It went on for a very long time. And the Turks gave a bloody nose to the British. So, as a fallout of that, Churchill had to resign his office. And subsequently, he wrote a 4-volume history of the First World War, essentially justifying what he did while he was in office. Now, subsequently, in his own political career, Churchill was seen as somebody who was bright but very capricious, who was seen as somebody who had good oratorical powers but had very limited stability. Now, there is an excellent biography of Churchill which finishes in 1939, and that's the key thing. Finishes in 1939 by Robert Rhodes James, which is titled Churchill, A Study in Failure. And Churchill in his times was a very unique political character. He was one of the few people who actually changed parties twice in a career in 15 years. He was first with the Conservatives, crossed the benches, went over to the Liberals, and then crossed back to the Conservatives. Now, in the age of Ayaram, Gayaram, this might seem as something which is completely normal. But in British politics in the early 20th century, it was something unheard of. So Churchill was not seen as somebody who was this thing. But Churchill found his métier during the Second World War. And he took office as Prime Minister at a time when the Axis, or the Nazi Germany and its allies, seemed to have the run of the war. When Britain was pushed to the wall, the United States was not involved, and the Russians had a treaty which was signed with Nazi Germany, which said that there would be a non-aggression pact. So Britain was practically pushed to the wall by itself and had to fight this war. And it was in those times that Churchill came into office. Now, Churchill's war aims, when he came in, were fairly simple and remained consistent almost through the war. The first was to preserve Britain's independence. The second, which in 1940, when Churchill actually came into war, was seemed like an enormous thing, which was to defeat Nazi Germany, but that was the sort of ultimate end. More importantly, Churchill realized that if this war had to be won, it could only be done by bringing the United States of America into this war. Then Churchill realized that his concept of strategy was that the war had to be taken to the enemy. Yeah, there was no point Britain sort of fortifying itself, building defenses. The French had tried that. The Maginot Line had failed. So what could Britain do? So Churchill believed that if this war had to be won, and it could only be won over a long period of time, it had to be done by taking the war to the enemy. This led Churchill to decide that we have to fight on secondary fronts. North Africa and the Mediterranean were two areas which Churchill identified as potential weak spots for the Axis powers, and he said that Britain should concentrate its war effort not only at home, but also in these theaters. And finally, Churchill knew that if Nazi Germany had to be defeated, it could only be done by carrying out an invasion of continental Europe, running all across from France to Germany, and defeating them comprehensively. Unconditional surrender was the only way that this war could end. So these were the war aims and strategy, remained more or less constant throughout this period. Now, Churchill too, like Lincoln, had a number of problems with his subordinates. The one person with whom he had a sort of a very tough love relationship was his Chief of Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke. Now, Alan Brooke's diaries have been posthumously published, and the full version has been published very recently, and it makes for fascinating reading into what are the sort of tussles which higher leadership in wartime undergoes, especially between political and military leaders. Here is an excerpt. This is what Alan Brooke wrote one of the days in his diaries. Churchill has got only half the picture in his mind, talks absurdities, and makes my blood boil. What a public menace he is and has been throughout the war. And Alan Brooke is writing this about his prime minister. So you can imagine what is the sort of tension which is going on there. But it is equally important to remember that Alan Brooke was picked personally by Churchill to become the Chief of General Staff. So Churchill, again, like Lincoln, was somebody who knew that his subordinates were problematic, but who also knew that they were the guys who could deliver him the results. So he had to find ways and means of handling them. This does not mean that Churchill tolerated people who did not perform. There were some generals whom he called unlucky generals, like Auchinleck and Wavell, who failed to deliver results in the North African campaign, and who were very tough-minded, practical, good military leaders, but whom Churchill had to ease out of their command. He sent them to India successively and put in other people. Bernard Montgomery, when he finally came and delivered, became the guy whom Churchill then relied upon. Having said this, General Hastings Ismay, who was Churchill's sort of military attaché during the war, said in his memoirs that not once during the whole war did Churchill overrule his military advisors on a purely military question. He would not overrule them, but this does not mean that he would keep quiet either. Now, Churchill wrote that it is not sufficient for a government to give general directive to beat the enemy and to wait and see what happens. He did not agree that the job of politicians was only to do the politics, to set the aims and then relax. But he said that you have to go into the detail. And this is what Churchill had. He had an insatiable craving and appetite for detail. The number of studies that he commissioned his military headquarters and his armed forces to come up is voluminous. If you look at Churchill's papers, most of them are different sorts of studies which Churchill commissioned on different aspects of the war: logistics, tactics, operations, strategy. At every level, Churchill was constantly asking for details. What is it that you're going to do? How is it? How robust is your analysis? So this constant probing was Churchill's sort of idea. And he would do successive iterations of the interrogation. It was not that he asked for a report, got it, and then kept quiet. And Churchill was a master of writing the short memorandum. He would read a 20-page report, write a 2-page comment, send it back to them. So that is what he did. He constantly pushed his subordinates to refine their thinking about what is it that they were trying to do. And in doing this, Churchill knew that he was antagonizing his subordinates. People felt that here is a prime minister who has never really fought a war and who's trying to tell us what we need to do. But Churchill said that war is a business of terrible pressures. If there is going to be a degree of pressure, let it be there. And it is in that creative tension which will come from this sort of interaction that any strategy can ultimately see the light of the day. Now, like Lincoln, and perhaps to a far greater extent, Churchill was absolutely fascinated with the technology in the waging of the Second World War. I don't think any other military leader of either the 19th or the 20th century took such a great degree of interest in what the technological changes were offering for him to conduct war, because he realized that technology was a crucial force multiplier in the implementation of any strategy. One of the great examples of this is the whole thing of air defenses, because when Churchill came to office, the idea was that if the enemy tried to bomb you through an air campaign, there was nothing that you could do. There was a famous saying in the mid-1930s that the bomber will always get through. That was the idea, that there was nothing to be done. So the only thing you could do was to do counteroffensives. But Churchill said that no, there's got to be something more that we can do. And he pushed the RAF, the Royal Air Force, to look at defensive measures. And the development of the radar, etc., was all measures which were spurred at Churchill's insistence. Now, in sort of understanding this technological bit, and Churchill had no background in science, a complete novice when it came to scientific matters, he relied on the man whom he called the Prof. Frederick Lindemann of Oxford University became sort of Churchill's advisor during the war on military technological issues. And Lindemann ran an office which was very right next to Churchill in a small alcove, where he had a team of statisticians. And Lindemann would constantly feed Churchill information about what were the new technological developments, what could they offer, how were the armed forces performing. Because one of the things which was happening was that, especially the Royal Air Force, was making extravagant claims about what is it that they're doing in terms of damage to Germany during the bombing campaign. And Lindemann developed a series of statistical techniques to assess the efficacy, what we in modern parlance will call bomb damage assessment. And this enabled Churchill to get a more realistic picture. And he would read those reports and then get back to the military and say, now listen, this is what I am told, what are you telling me? So that was again Churchill at work completely. The other sort of related issue to that of technology was Churchill's great interest in issues of intelligence, in what he saw both as an effort to try and break into the coding system of the opponent, also to carry out what might be called as counterintelligence operations, which is that operations designed to confuse the enemy about what is done. And this led to a great effort. One of the greatest efforts during the Second World War by Britain was the center in Bletchley Park, which was essentially a code cracking unit. Nearly 10,000 people worked there, all of them drawn from civilian walks of life. And they were people who managed to crack the German code, the Enigma machine, which then gave the British unparalleled opportunities to understand how the Germans were planning the different offensives. And that was something which really was crucial to British war effort during the Second World War. And this again came at Churchill's insistence. A lot of people used to think that this guy's got crazy ideas. He thinks that this is a game of cops and robbers. This is a game where you think that you can act like a James Bond or something like that. But Churchill realized that this was serious activity. He ensured as Prime Minister that resources and effort was devoted to these things. So there again you see a leader who sees that there is something new. There is something new which needs to be done in order to achieve certain objectives and pushes resources against the current of the bureaucratic and sort of organizational pressures of the day. And the final example I want to give is that of Churchill's interest in what are now known as special forces, units which are tasked to carry out very specialized activities which involve a rigorous degree of training, which are naturally conceived to be elite units of any armed forces. The Churchill was instrumental in raising what later came to be known as the commandos. The commandos were a group of people who were carrying out raiding activities against German-held territories in Europe. Similarly, he also was very instrumental in pushing for what were known as the Chindits, a group of units which were raised here in India to fight the war against the Japanese in Burma. Both of these involved commandos and Chindits, special units which needed special resources, which needed to be justified, saying that the effort which was being put in was worth it. Now, Churchill's subordinates were right in pointing out to him that the military effect of these units was actually negligible. This was a huge war. I mean, what are we talking about? What can a small raid do? What can a group of Chindits who can infiltrate enemy lines behind in Burma do to the Japanese? Which is very true. But Churchill also realized that if you had to fight a war for 5 years, you have to sustain the morale of the people. You need to give them a sense that this is a war which can ultimately be won. And that is where he saw the importance of these things, not just in terms of the military value, but in terms of the larger effort at the domestic front. So here, once again, you see that what a military leader or a leader who specialized in a particular activity might not be able to see, the leadership at the top, the political leadership, has to be able to see. Now, Churchill differed from his military subordinates at several key points in the war. At a number of points he was wrong, but there were some very important points on which he was right. He was very right to insist that the battle had to be fought in the Mediterranean and North Africa in 1941, and that Britain should not exclusively defend themselves in British territory. His military leadership and the general staff was telling him that the Russians were going to collapse in 1941. But Churchill had the better political sense to realize that this was not going to happen, and that finally the Russians will become part of the effort against Nazi Germany itself. So he sort of did away with any defeatism which his groups had. And last and most important, the Normandy invasion of 1944, which is the invasion into France, which happened from Britain, and which then subsequently led to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the overrunning of the continent of Europe which happened, was something which Churchill was very interested in. But this is what Alan Brooks said. He said it may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war. Now, if Churchill had risen to Allenbrook, it's quite possible that the war might have gone on for much longer and that you might have to try many more funny things. So Churchill differed from his military subordinates. He was wrong at certain points, but he was right. But never did he stop questioning them. That's the important thing. Now, the conduct of the war also meant that Churchill had to give a great degree of attention to a number of things. The Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union was one thing. Churchill was a fervent anti-communist. He had denounced Stalinist Russia in very strong terms in the 1930s. But he realized when the time came that, and as he said in a very famous phrase, that if I have to hold the hand with the devil, I will do it in order to win this war effort. He also cultivated the Americans very sedulously, very aggressively. He used to write to Franklin Roosevelt, "Dear Mr. President," a series of letters. The Roosevelt-Churchill correspondence is voluminous, runs into almost 300 letters. Churchill was an old man when he began to take charge of the war effort, but he traveled all the way to Atlantic in order to meet Roosevelt and tell him that the Americans needed to get into this war. So he was willing to go the distance. And finally, once the Soviet Union and the United States came into the war, Britain was the junior partner. The kind of resources which they had was very limited. But nevertheless, Churchill realized that if he had to shape the war effort, even within these constraints, he would have to make use of his position very adroitly. And finally, Churchill made some very serious, grim choices during the Second World War. The violation of Norway's neutrality. Norway was supposedly neutral territory, overrun by the Nazis, but Churchill violated its neutrality. Even more important was the sinking of the French fleet at Oran in North Africa in 1940. And what happened was that when France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the French colonies in North Africa also surrendered. They put up the white flag, and the Germans came, and they decided that they would go over and become part of the occupying forces. Now, the French had a fleet which was which was stationed in North Africa, which had 20,000 French sailors. And one of the toughest decisions which Churchill had to do was to destroy this particular fleet. And he gave orders to destroy it. Remember, France was England's ally. But he said that 20,000 people, a huge French fleet, doesn't matter. It has to be done. It has to be done because people should know that we are serious about doing this war. So that is the sort of decisions which he had to take. And finally, the firebombing of Germany. I mean, the Second World War literature all talks about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and so on. But the firebombing campaigns which were done in Germany and in Japan caused many more casualties. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden were just destroyed by overnight continuous bombing. These were unethical choices to make. But Churchill made it in the full realization that this was a war and that he was responsible. And if the moral flaw had to be attached to somebody, it was he who had to take it as the leader. Finally, Churchill's most important thing, like Lincoln again, was to keep the spirits of his people up. And this he did, as John F. Kennedy said, by mobilizing the English language and sending it into battle. And here, as we all know, Churchill was a great master of words, but he was not the sort of more, stirring things that we remember about those things, that we'll fight in the beaches and so on, was only a very minuscule part of these speeches. Many of these speeches actually went into great detail about the conduct of the war, how the war effort was shaping, where were they, where did they want to go. He would conceal no defeats and minimize no reverses. Every point had to be told to the people. People should know what is happening. And finally, once the war was won, Churchill said that the British people had a lion's heart. I was merely privileged to give the roar. So here was a leader who did not take credit for what he had actually done. This is a cartoon from the Second World War time, which tells you something about what the British people saw Churchill's role as cocking a snook at the Nazis and telling them that we will fight you. So Churchill, this is why he's remembered as a great war leader. Okay, quickly now to Indira Gandhi, a person who came into office largely seen as her father's daughter, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, first Prime Minister of India, a person who had very little initiation into politics formally, and who was made Prime Minister in 1966, primarily because the Congress party then thought that she was the Gungi Gudiya. She was a dumb doll, the person who would sort of dance to their tunes, all of which turned out to be very wrong. By 1967, Indira Gandhi had broken the Congress, and then she had prepared for office very well. Now, the strategic context of the Bangladesh war is very well known to all of us. I will not dwell on it and in great length. What happened was that 25th of March, 1971, the Pakistan army decided to crack down on the Awami League, which had won the elections there, in order to prevent a Bengali government being formed in Pakistan. This led to a great inflow of refugees from what is today called Bangladesh, then was known as East Pakistan, into Indian territory. Okay, now one of the things which Indira Gandhi had to do right at the beginning was to evaluate her options, was to see what is it that she could do in order to prevent this thing happening. Her own instinct initially, from some accounts, was that to send the Indian forces across the border in order to, bring an end to the massacre and possibly create an independent country. But her chief of the army staff, Sam Manekshaw, who spoke to her, told her that this was not an option which could be done at the moment, because the Indian army needed to be prepared for this sort of an offensive. Secondly, this sort of an offensive could not be taken at a time when the monsoons were likely to break out, which meant that the offensive would get bogged down. And finally, he said that, what will we do if the Chinese decide to give us an ultimatum? So we had to wait till such time the Himalayan passes had closed, and then we could do it. Now, Indira Gandhi interrogated Sam Manekshaw for almost a day. At the end of the day, Sam said, do you want me to resign? And she said, don't be silly. I just want to make sure that we are on the same track as with these things. But once she had found that Sam understood what she wanted, and once she knew that her chief of staff knew that this is what the country wanted to go, she let him get on with the job. Now, the war aims were fairly simple, was to prevent the influx of refugees. 10 million refugees, which was the ultimate number which the Indian government says, is a huge number for any country to absorb, and create conditions in East Pakistan for the refugees to return. This essentially means that either there should be a new power sharing agreement or a sort of a quasi-independent state in East Pakistan. The way to do it was to bring diplomatic efforts to isolate and pressurize Pakistan, was to provide support to Bengali guerrillas. They came to be known as the Mukti Fauj and subsequently the Mukti Bahini, who were operating out of Indian territory. Military intervention was seen as the instrument of the last resort if everything else failed. But interestingly, like Lincoln, Indira Gandhi said that the first shot has to be fired by the Pakistanis. Because if I have to fight this war, I have to fight it from the best possible moral and legitimate high ground. Okay? Now, in terms of managing this crisis, Mrs. Gandhi had a number of challenges. The first was handling domestic pressure, because groups in India started clamoring for immediate action. They said that, what is this government doing? It's just sitting tight and doing nothing while we are having to absorb these many refugees, while there is a genocide of sorts going on across the border. So there's great pressure. And this pressure was not just coming from what you might see as the traditionally right-wing end of the Indian political spectrum. It was also coming from the left. The left also was pressurizing the government that something needed to be done. People like Jayaprakash Narayan, who was seen as sort of Gandhian, a great statesman for peace, was pressurizing Indira Gandhi to say that, take action and take it now. And these were the sorts of pressures that she had to fend away. Secondly, she had to maintain ties with what came to be known as the Bangladesh government in exile. They set up in a place called Mujibnagar, which is actually in central Calcutta. And the government in exile was asking the Indian government to recognize it forthwith in April 1971. But Indira Gandhi knew that if she recognized this government before the conditions were created where this government could actually flourish, then it is going to be a pointless exercise. So once again, she had to fend off pressure from allies as well, not just from domestic constituencies. And finally, there was a great pressure which came from the United States of America, because under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the Americans decided that the Yahya Khan regime could not be just sent down the tube in Pakistan, and that whatever needed to be done gradually. And once the Americans made it clear to the Indians that they were opening up a relationship with China, and that in the future, if something happened with the Chinese, etc., the Americans will not come to India's assistance, Mrs. Gandhi decided that something drastic had to be done. And this led to the conclusion of a treaty with the Soviet Union, a clear repudiation of India's principle of non-alignment, a policy which her father had laid down, but which she felt that she needed to override at this point of time. It also meant that she had to undertake an offensive in order to drive a wedge between America and its European allies, because she realized that Europeans might not necessarily see this situation in East Pakistan in the same terms as she did that, as the Americans. And this meant that she spent a lot of time shaping international opinion. Now, there's a very nice clipping of Indira Gandhi being interviewed by a BBC correspondent, available on YouTube. If you just do a search for Indira Gandhi, you'll be able to see it, where she says that she equates this with what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany. She says, it's genocide. Would you guys have just stood by and done nothing? So that is the key thing. She was able to evoke the right sort of parallel in order to send a message to people that this is a very different situation, needed to be handled differently. Now, the conduct of the war. The first shot, as Indira Gandhi wanted, was fired by Pakistan. The Pakistanis took the bait. They succumbed to the military pressure, fired the first shot. In managing the war effort itself, Indira Gandhi chose a core group of 4 people who were very close to her, who were all people who were working with her, in order to manage this effort. And she used them not only to get day-to-day feedback in this thing, but she herself would spend quite a few nights during the 13 days of war in the army, with the army headquarters and so on, in order to know what is happening. She was very close to the operational detail. And every morning, she would ask the chief of the army staff, Sam Manekshaw, to come and have breakfast with her. So that was a good way, again, for them to sort of know what was happening, keep tab of things. And finally, the objectives of this war also expanded as the war progressed. Because initially when the war began, the Indians were not thinking in terms of creating a fully new country. What they thought was that possibly they might be able to carve out some territory in East Pakistan where the new Bangladeshi government could be installed. And then we could take it on from there. But once the Pakistani resistance started crumbling and operational commanders on the ground said that here is a good opportunity, we can actually go to Dhaka, Indira Gandhi said, okay, we'll expand the objectives of the war. And she recognized Bangladesh on the 6th of December 1971. But the country itself was created a week later. Now, towards the close of the war, there was great pressure from the UN and the United States, both of which she had to fend off. The United States in particular sent out one of their carriers from the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal in order to tell the Indians that we cannot tolerate any further action and so on. And this is when Indira Gandhi gave what is rightly, I think, seen as one of her most important speeches during the war. And she was supposed to give this speech on All India Radio, but she said that no, this is an important moment, 12th of December 1971, and I will speak to a gathering of people. And there she said, we will not retreat, not by a single step will we move over. This was very important, because this gave a clear message to the Americans that this is not going to happen. 3 days later, there was a surrender at Dhaka. Now, what was Indira Gandhi's reaction when East Pakistan fell? There was a great pressure from some of her cabinet colleagues, and apparently the defense minister of the day as well, that the war should also be extended to West Pakistan, because they felt that this is a good time to give the blow to the Pakistanis and finish them off once and for all. But Indira Gandhi realized that there was a point at which she needed to stop, the culminating point of the victory. And she told one of her close aides, H.Y. Sharda Prasad, that if I'm not able to do, that is, if I'm not able to give a ceasefire call today, I will not be able to do it tomorrow, because the pressure for war will always build up. And finally, the other thing which she told after making her announcement in Parliament about the creation of Bangladesh to another very close friend was, we won the war, but will we win the peace? So there you have a leader who knows that war as an activity is not something which is just to be fought for itself, but has to serve some larger purposes. So what does all of this tell us, these 3 case studies about leadership and strategy? First thing, the importance of picking and managing willful, energetic, if somewhat disobedient subordinates. It is what one scholar has called the unequal dialogue. It is unequal because the political leader and his subordinates are not on the same plane. But nevertheless, it has to be a dialogue as well. You have to let it go on both sides, on the understanding that it's never going to be an even playing field. The other thing is that expert opinion always needs to be questioned. As Henry Adams, an American writer, said, in all emergencies, more or less everyone is wrong. So everyone's opinion has to be questioned. Nothing is to be taken for granted just because a group of experts are telling you. Fascination with detail, very, very important. And it was important for all the 3 leaders because they stayed very close to the detail. In the case of Lincoln and Churchill, not just the military detail, but also logistics, also technology, very important to make sure that their war aims were met. Isaiah Berlin, who's an English philosopher, said that a statesman, a good statesman, needs something more than just the detail. He needs to be able to bring all these details together, a capacity for integrating all this changing, multicolored, evanescent, perpetually overlapping data. Too many, too swift, too intermingled to be caught and pinned down and labeled like so many individual butterflies. So that's something which a statesman is supposed to have, is the ability not just to look into detail, but to be able to integrate it and get a sense of what the larger picture is. Ability to discern what is new. What is new technology? How can it help to discern what is a new strategic situation? When does Lincoln decide that he needs to give the Emancipation Proclamation? Because the conditions have changed. So objectives will change as a war progresses. So you need to be alert to these changing strategic conditions. War, as an American general once said, is an option of difficulties. And there are times when you have to decide that you want to overrule your advisors and subordinates. This should not be done heedlessly, this should not be done recklessly, but with an understanding that it is sometimes necessary to do this. And finally, all successful wartime statesmen were good judges of people. They knew about what the weaknesses of the people they were working with, what their strengths were, and how they could balance it. William Gladstone, a Prime Minister of Britain in the 19th century, said that one must be a good butcher. You need to know when you need to take people off the table. Now, most of these war leaders had a combination of determination and what I call as moderation. Determination to press ahead with what their objectives were in the face of an impeding movement, because the other side is trying to do something, because your own subordinates are not able to deliver, because the conditions are not propitious of success. But at the same time, once they managed to reach the point of success, they knew where to stop, where to moderate. This was very important. The culminating point of the victory is something we need to bear in mind, because everything is susceptible to overreach in life. And this is something which all of them knew and tried and cultivated. Now, at the same time, this moderation was not incompatible with the degree of ruthlessness. Tough choices had to be made. Exceptional circumstances call for exceptional measures. This is what President George W. Bush said. Whether he did the right thing or not is a different issue. But there are times when leaders have to take tough decisions. And you have to take those tough, ruthless decisions in the knowledge that ultimately the burden, the responsibility of it will rest on you. Finally, this is the second last point I want to make, is the importance of communication. All of these leaders were masters of the communication. They knew how to write a short note, how to get their ideas across without ambiguity, without giving unnecessary, without obfuscating the detail. And at the same time, they had the ability to convince their stakeholders, convince their people that these were activities which needed to be indulged in and that these were sacrifices which needed to be made. So this ability to sort of communicate both one's efforts to subordinates and to other people played a very crucial part in the way that these leaders succeeded in what they tried to do. And finally, all of them acted in what is known as the fog of the war. Now, this phrase refers to the fact that warfare or any strategic activity, because it is interdependent, because it depends on what the other person is going to do, will be carried out in an atmosphere of imperfect information. You will never have the full information to make the best informed choice. You never will know whether what is happening on the ground really tallies with what you think is happening on the ground. You never know whether the orders that you give will be implemented in the way that you want them to be implemented. But the ability to understand that this uncertainty is there, but nevertheless have the courage to go forward and accept these risks and to act is what made all of these leaders great wartime leaders. In the 19th century, in Victorian England, they used to call this moral courage as opposed to physical courage. And I think it was Winston Churchill who once rightly said that courage is the first of all virtues. Everything follows from it. Thank you.
That was really wonderful. We'll take the question and answers and limit that to about half an hour because we conclude at 1. We would move from this end and come this way. Yes. People who have not got an opportunity till now would get a priority, but the route that we follow would be this way. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Srinath Raghavan from Tata Steel. I mean, in today's world, the reason for a conflict or a war is slightly different. How would you rate the former President George Bush's strategy and leadership vis-a-vis the conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Srinath can take more questions. So maybe I'll assist Dr. Anuradha Reddy and ask Commodore Karambir Singh to have his question.
Thank you. I just want to bring out this point about close oversight and fascination for detail. It's got this chance of being confused, and there's a very thin dividing line between all this and micromanagement. We have seen the kind of micromanagement John McNamara decided to do in Vietnam and what are the consequences. So we have to be very careful in suggesting that the political leaders get into this concept of fascination for detail. I think the fascination for detail must be more in the planning stage and not in the conduct. Because that is where you start creating problems in the very conduct of battle or any business strategy. So this dividing line must be well understood, and I feel that is where people shouldn't go wrong.
Right. If I can answer the second question first. Yeah, micromanagement, the long screwdriver, all of these things are absolutely right. But I think the suggestion that there is a dividing line between political and military roles is something which I do not subscribe to, because I think strategy is fundamentally political. All activities down to the tactical level will be influenced by political considerations. if the Israelis are targeting, say, a small group of what they claim as mortal locations for the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, that has got political implications because that is being televised. That's leading to civilian casualties. So I don't think there is anything called purely military realm or purely tactical. I can understand why, as a military person, we would like to look at it that way. Let me just finish. The example of McNamara in Vietnam, I think, is a good example of how a particular reading of history has been used in order to reinforce what are seen as good lessons or wrong lessons. McNamara did micromanage one aspect of the Vietnam strategy, the air campaign. Did he micromanage the ground campaign? Did he even look closely at what was happening? Did he understand the need for a counterinsurgency strategy? No. So clearly, the flaw was not just about micromanaging in one aspect, but of not managing at all in another. So I think a balance has to be struck. While I would fully agree with you that people should be given the freedom to carry out what they want to do, at the same time, the oversight has to be quite strong. I understand that from the military perspective, this does not seem like a good thing to do, but I think that's the way it works. Yeah.
Sorry. No, what I meant was that it's all very fine to micromanage it. Please do that at the planning stage. If Israel does a particular attack on a particular thing, it should have been foreseen. It should be planned in advance. Because once you start doing the micromanage at that level, then you start interfering with the very conduct of professionals, and which in any company I don't think anyone would like.
I would fully agree with that, which is that at the level of execution, people should be given a free hand to execute. But the problem with any strategy, as you are very well aware, sir, is that no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. This is what von Moltke said, and it's true. It's true of war as it's true for any business activity. You can plan anything that you want, as long as there is another person on the other side who's also planning. Any plan is likely to go awry. So, which means that there has got to be a degree of oversight. And that oversight has to be, you're absolutely right. If you're starting to sort of give tactical orders to people on the ground to say, use this position, use that, it is going to impede effectiveness. So balance has to be struck between the considerations of military efficacy and what are the wider political objectives that you're finding. And that is something which I think in all of these cases work well when there is a good personal rapport between the commanders and the political leaders. It tends to go awry when there is a gap between them. And that's what happened in Vietnam, which is in that sense a very right example. The other question about George W. Bush and Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, in terms of leadership, again, did George W. Bush really, George Bush is seen as somebody who takes tough decisions. That's the sort of image that he's been trying to give over the last few days. That they were tough decisions, I took them, time to move on now. But the key thing is, did he actually look at how his strategies or plans were being implemented? Did you look closely at what is happening on the ground? I mean, if you look back to the early days after the Iraq invasion in 2003, George Bush made a statement saying, okay, these guys want to attack us, the insurgents, the Al-Qaeda, bring them on. That's not the sort of a statement which any responsible war leader will make. Because you have to understand what the situation on the ground is and what happened thereafter. Yeah, exactly. There was an insurgency which was coming. These people kept denying that it was there. And ultimately, you had to deal with the consequences of it, which the next administration will also be dealing with. So I think his leadership was a failure, primarily because he just did not understand that strategy is not just about talking, but also about doing. And that's where the mismatch was.
Okay, Defense Minister was Mr. Krishna Menon, and one favorite military commander was there, General Call. So can I request you to, I'm sure you would have studied that as well. So some of the lessons which you can draw where we had failed and how we should, derive some useful insights and lessons from that.
Absolutely, sir. And in fact, I have 2 whole chapters in my forthcoming book on 1962. The reason why I didn't speak on that is because, I want to speak more about successful wartime. But you're right. If you want to look at it, you will need to look at both sides of the coin. The example of Krishna Menon Call is a very good example of what happens when top leadership is chosen not for their professional competence, but for what is seen as political acceptability. Which was not the case with any of the other leaders that I was trying to say. I mean, somebody like Lincoln chose Ulysses S. Grant as his commander-in-chief. The guy was an alcoholic, but Grant was not a fool. He subsequently became the president of the United States in 1870. So Lincoln knew that this was a man who was flawed in certain respects, but who could deliver in others. Whereas people like Krishna Menon and Jawaharlal Nehru at that point of time did not realize that B.M. Call, or one can even push the point and argue General Thapar, who was then the chief of the army staff, were not people who were really up to tackling the challenge which was being posed at the point of time. So the fundamental problem, yes, I think the great lesson is essentially reinforcing the point which I'm trying to say, which is that you need to be able to pick up the right subordinates and then guide and manage them. That was the first test which they failed. And once they failed it, then, as you're rightly saying, in NIFA, what happened was a debacle which flowed from that particular decision. I would fully agree.
Mr. Kailasanathan from Titan Industries.
My question is simple. Why is it that heroes who win the wars subsequently lose the election battle? It happened to Churchill and it happened to Indira Gandhi subsequently. What was the reason?
Right, because with Churchill, I think it's an easy answer, because Churchill was never seen as somebody who would make a very good peacetime prime minister. Churchill was seen as somebody who was a wartime prime minister. You know, people, as I mentioned, Churchill's career in the 1930s was seen as somebody who was very whimsical and capricious in his approach to domestic politics. So, and also at the end of the Second World War, there was a great realization in British society that the sort of fundamental social arrangements in this political community needed to change, that a welfare state had to come into being. The people who had sacrificed their lives for the war needed something better. And the Churchill and the Conservative Party were not really geared to giving them any of those things, which is why the Labour won. Why do other people lose? Indira Gandhi, she did not quite lose the election. I mean, she went on, in fact, to impose the emergency. So, in a sense, on the contrary, I would think that a number of cases, successful wartime leaders usually also tend to be successful at least tend to be successful in winning elections. Whether they actually perform that way or not is a different thing. You could take the case of General Eisenhower, who went on to become president. Or the Israeli case has got a number of examples. Ariel Sharon, Ehud Barak, Yitzhak Rabin, all of them chiefs of the Israeli army at some point of time or the other. Because it's a society which places a great degree of value. So I think the ultimate thing has got to be, what is it that the society wants? If it is looking for peacetime values, different sorts of issues, it's unlikely that a successful wartime general will be elected to office.
Mr. Niranjanaka from Center for Airborne Systems.
Thank you, Madam. In the three cases what you presented, in my opinion, neither the Americans nor the British, when they fought the wars for whatever reasons, they must have gained something, but never they lost anything. But if you come to our Indian scenario, it's we. India created one country, then made it into two countries, we gave the land, and we took some decisions to fight wars against them and free the Bangladeshis. Do you think or did you think that any time that our leadership at that time, when they took the decisions, any time thought of that consequences, which we are seeing in politics even now, deep hill south, and where they indicated, Kapoor was indicating how they are fighting. There's one example here, there are so many things happening. What is your view on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the long-term consequences of any decision is something that people should think about. And that is arguably one place where one can fault the Indian leadership in 1947, because even people like who were otherwise seen as sort of fairly pragmatic statesmen like Sardar Patel believed that even if you agree to partition now, the Pakistanis will come back at some point because sheer unviability of a new country in that state. But that turned out to be a completely wrong calculation. So yes, leaders have to make sort of decisions with a view to where it might be, and that is where I think strategic thinking really comes into being, which is that you've got to understand how a situation will change and how new circumstances can be created. But having said that, there are limits to the ability to see something in prospect, and it's very easy to criticize it in retrospect because we've got 20/20 hindsight. We know how things play out. We know what's happening in Kashmir today. But could we realistically expect people should have known all of these things? Some of them, yes. All of them, possibly.
Mr. Sheshagiri Rao, please.
Thank you, sir, for your nice speech. See, in the contemporary world, I see three types of nations-wise leadership. One is Israel surviving with a host of hostile nations around, and US actually behaving as if like a policeman, and USSR is split up into number of countries. But these attitudes of these leaders are taking the world into a chaos in future, or the United States has got no role in limiting any of these things.
Yeah, we can take more questions. Mr. Srinath.
past wars, but I think what the political leadership in future would be challenged with probably is not wars, because in the Indian context, India in any war is seen as equal to many. So nobody will engage in a war with India. Probably the political leadership has to deal with conflicts. So do you see a change in context, and could you guide us on that?
On the first question, yes, you're right. I mean, the way that the Americans are going about is might be seen by others as being imperialistic and so on. But the Americans themselves think that it's a great leadership role that that they play, and that's historically the way that they've seen themselves. I mean, even somebody like Barack Obama, who is otherwise comes across as someone who wants to work with the international community, in his inaugural speech he said that America is ready to lead. So that's the sort of vision that they have of their country. They believe that they have the manifest destiny, that history is on their side, and that they have to lead and so on. So, which obviously that kind of arrogance of power is what leads to a number of strategic blunders. So yeah, I think one of the key, which is why I think if the Americans look back into their own history, I mean, when they look back at somebody like Abraham Lincoln or even George Washington, who was fighting a battle for the very creation of the United States, those people realized that there were limits to what is the kind of power that anybody can exercise. That power is not something which is unlimited, that to the extent that power refers to the capacity to influence others, others will also have a capacity to influence or to at least resist your attempts to influence them. So the very strategic nature of these concepts means that there are inherent limitations to it. And I think the successful statesmen were those who managed to recognize that there are limits to all of these things, and that it is within those limits that they have to further their goals and ambitions. On the second point, you're absolutely right. In fact, that's one point which I should have made at the beginning, which is that all of these are examples of what you might call as high-intensity conflicts. Some of them are conflicts for survival of nation states, the American Civil War and the Second World War at least. So clearly, there are. It's unlikely that those sorts of conflicts are going to be fought. But the question is whether the sort of broad issues of strategic leadership will differ considerably in the other cases. If anything, I would think that there will be a greater degree of involvement of the leadership on sort of day-to-day activities and so on, and that the sort of ability to understand the changing situation and to know what are the sort of force multipliers which are now available in terms of technology, and to know how these can be amalgamated into one strategy to pursue your interests, remains fundamentally the same. So the logic of strategy, I don't think, is fundamentally changed, whether you're talking about a great war or you're talking about a limited war or a conflict or a mere crisis. So the fundamental challenges are the same. The scale of activities and the type of strategies that you wish to pursue might differ, but then history will never repeat itself. So.
Dr. Amarjeet Singh.
So you have described the successful leaders, and you said that Indira won the war for us, and she is a successful leader. But I wanted to ask you why her father, Mr. Nehru, never wanted Indira to be the PM itself. He expressed that opinion. Is it that the father could not understand her daughter and her potential?
Mr. Srivastava.
You have given 3 examples for leadership and strategy related to war, and you have also narrated that Churchill and other people during the period, they showed at times the qualities of a dictator. So is the leader required to show some attributes of dictators also?
Right. On the issue of Nehru and no, I don't think so. I think Jawaharlal Nehru was thinking that she would have some sort of a public office. She used to manage his house, Murthy, and so on. And he possibly thought that subsequently she might become High Commissioner to Britain or something like that. Some sort of a low-key but public role nevertheless. But it was in Nehru's time in office that Indira Gandhi was appointed as Secretary General of the Congress Party. She was very instrumental in kicking out the communist government led by E.M.S. Namboodiripad in the late 1950s. So I think Jawaharlal Nehru was fundamentally a person who believed that the leadership should be chosen by the party. To that extent, he was someone who, for all his flaws and weaknesses, I think he was somebody who tried to show by his own example that what a functioning democracy should look like. I mean, the easiest thing for Jawaharlal Nehru would have been to assume a sort of a Caesarian dictatorship, because he was so popular with people, he could always have said that, I can override public opinion. But that was something he never did. And his entire sort of political career was geared towards the idea that certain political norms and values should be institutionalized in this new democracy. And I think he saw promoting a dynasty as something which was not the right way to progress further. So I don't think he was ever interested in projecting her. I'm not so sure whether he underestimated her or not. But having said that, I think Indira also came into her own right only subsequently, once she came to power and so on. And she showed that sort of a will to power, which then went to a different extreme during the emergencies and brought her downfall ultimately. But I don't think he would have quite seen the sort of drive to power which his daughter had. So you're right, possibly he underestimated her. The other question. Yes, I think it is important to understand that leaders will have to take unpleasant and ruthless decisions, especially in these sorts of high pressure situations where margin for error is very low. Now, the test of any of those things will be how well has it succeeded? Has it really gone about in furthering the aims and objectives of the particular war? If you take, you might override normal sort of constitutional norms, laws and ethical mores and so on, but everything comes at a cost. A prime example of this is the Guantanamo Bay and the American policy to decide to sort of hold people there indefinitely without trial, without being able to have any access to either courts or to be released. Now, President Bush, I'm sure, when he writes his memoirs, will say that that was a tough decision. It was a decision which he had to take in order to protect the American people. That's a line he's taken so far, that's a line his supporters will take. But the question of all of these things is, has it really helped? Did it really help to override constitutional norms? Did it really help to say that the American Constitution is not applicable in Guantanamo because that's a territory we released from Cuba? Clearly not. Those things are backfired and they are a very big problem for the next administration. So I think the test of any of those tough decisions will be to what extent it furthers the objectives. When Churchill decided to sink the French fleet off the coast of North Africa, killing 20,000 French sailors, it was a tough decision. But it was a decision which sent out a message to the Americans that Churchill and Britain were willing to fight this war even if they were going to be completely alone. And that then enabled the Americans to start taking them seriously, and Franklin Roosevelt decided to come to.
Mr. Ramdas, did you have a question?
No,
I thought you had...
I already asked this question.
Please make it brief.
You know, the tradition. You made a comparison of wartime with leadership. War is always as a winner and loser. The leadership is always the enemies of evil. If we take the example of the 1871 war, while it has given a great victory for our country and a great pride for all of us, the surrender of the Pakistani army, even today they carry the wound. You know what's happening in the last, from 1971 till date. Yesterday's brigade presentation focusing on what are the issues. So my question was really from Lyndon's point, is this the leadership focus to have short-term win or have the long-term focus? So that at the end of the day, there's always a win-win, so that life is peaceful across the world. This is the holy, this is what I saw. Yeah.
Mr. Govardhan?
My question related to post-Indira Gandhi. Post-Indira Gandhi, has our strategy changed? Because we had a leader of the caliber of Indira Gandhi who could really chalk out a strategy and also achieve the goal that she had set, because we created Bangladesh. But at present, I don't see any that kind of a leadership. Or are we compelled by the kind of political arrangements that we have today? Because we also have a conflict going on at present. Whether we really have a strategy or it's more tactical in nature. Could you comment on that?
First question about looking beyond the war to the kind of peace that follows.
if I understand that's what you were talking about. Absolutely, it's very critical to understand that every war will leave a legacy of bitterness, of ill feeling, of hatred, which needs to be overcome, and that is what traditionally efforts at building peace were supposed to be doing. And if you look at the case of the 1971 war, you're absolutely right. The Pakistanis still harbor a great degree of bitterness. But one of the reasons why the Indians let the Pakistanis get away on such loose terms during the Simla conference, the subsequent peace conference after the 1971 war, was precisely this, that they did not want to create lasting bitterness. I mean, let's remember that between the end of the war and the Simla conference, the Indians had 90,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. It is a kind of leverage which India is never ever going to get again over Pakistan. And if we had squeezed them hard at that point of time, anything could have happened. West Pakistan too might have imploded, for all we know. But Mrs. Gandhi decided that it was not the right thing to do because of the same reasons that you were saying. Now, but again, in retrospect, was that the right decision to make? People will say that no, maybe we should have gone ahead and finished the Pakistanis off once and for all. So all of these decisions are always going to be difficult to make, which is why these are decisions of choices between life and death, between peace and war, are never going to be decisions which are easy to make. So the best we can hope for is that the people who are leading the armed forces, of engaging, allowing our military forces to be led into war, will also look something beyond the immediate objectives of the war to see what a sustainable peace might look like. I mean, if you look at the case of, say, the American Civil War, the American Civil War left a great legacy of bitterness. The American South, till the 1960s, full century after the end of the American Civil War, never reconciled itself to the fact that their institutions of slavery, etc., were forcibly dissolved and that they were destroyed in that manner. So, even for a country like America, which we see as a sort of very stable polity, these sorts of issues were very, very important. So, yes, you're absolutely right. So, the best we can hope for is that the people whom we trust to lead us will look to these things when they are taking us to those perils. Right. On the issue of current leadership, it is a little difficult always to sort of comment on contemporary events because as a historian, I find it always easier to look back to what happened in the past rather than either to say what is happening now or what might happen in the future. But nevertheless, I mean, I don't think Indira Gandhi was, if I was giving an impression that she was some sort of a great war leader and so on, that's not the impression I want to give. She was a successful war leader. She was a person who rose to the challenges of the moment and who rallied around the country and gave the armed forces the right sort of, go ahead and made sure that the objectives were met in that sense. So, in a sense, she was a successful leader. I'm not so sure that she was a great leader. I wouldn't even know how to qualify somebody as a great leader. But I mean, has Indian politics since, say, the early 1990s, with the era of the coalitions and so on, made this sort of thing difficult? I would say yes, because if you look at, say, 1971, Indira Gandhi was riding on the crest of a great victory, because one of the sort of masterstrokes of her 1971 election was that she split the state level elections and the central level elections. Yep. Till then they were going on in parallel. Whenever the state's union election would happen, the state elections would also happen. But Indira Gandhi, destroyed the link between those two, called for central government elections earlier, primarily because she believed that she wanted to project a national image, not just be reliant on what's happening on the states, or focus on state level issues, but focus on her and focus on the national level issues. And that worked off. That paid off very well. She won by a huge margin. Possibly only Rajiv Gandhi, when he got elected immediately after Indira's assassination, had that sort of a mandate. But you're right. I mean, the coalition of today will create different sorts of pressures, and it possibly adds one more element to what I was saying, in the need to manage, your own political coalition partners. How is it that you can take them on board and so on? Because there will be contending pressures. For instance, the DMK today is saying that the Indian government should get involved in Sri Lanka, that they should call for an immediate ceasefire. The central government is clearly not very interested in doing. So those are the sorts of pressures which will be, which if anything means that political leadership in this particular era is going to be even more difficult.
Brigadier Devendra Kapoor.
Thank you for an excellent expose. My question stems is in the immediate neighborhood. We find that there is, in Sri Lanka, there is a situation which is coming where possibly it is at the defining moment. The fear or the concern is that the uncertainty or the instability is now going to come to India. And that is the biggest concern as a defense person. If you look into the looking glass, what would you visualize? What should be the strategy of our leaders to tackle this new problem which is likely to emerge?
I'm very sure, sir, that you're better qualified to answer this question than I am. But since you asked me, I will take a cut at it. Yes, you're absolutely right. The LTT seems on its last legs. From what we know in terms of newspapers and media reportage, is that they are hold on to the Mullaitivu area now. But the key problem, as you're rightly saying, is that there are about 250,000 Tamil civilians who are also holed up in those areas. It is not clear whether the LTT is coercing them to be there, though one cannot put it past the LTT. But nevertheless, if there is a humanitarian crisis, you're right to say that yes, that instability will affect India. Which is why I would think that what the Indian government is doing now is the right thing, which is to say that we stand for a united Sri Lanka, that we do not want the breakup of Sri Lanka, but we want Tamils to be given the right this thing. But I think the government needs to do a little more in terms of pushing the Sri Lankan government towards actually either giving shape to the treaties which have been signed earlier, the Indo-Sri Lankan Agreement of '87, which was then reflected in the 13th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution, which says that there will be federal autonomy for the Tamil provinces in the east and the north. But the Sri Lankan government has not done anything so far to implement those things, nor is the Rajapaksa government seem particularly promising in terms of what they want to do. It's very clear that they are riding on the way of Sinhala military victories and Sinhala supremacy. So I think the Indian government needs definitely to do more at the political level to ensure that the people, that the Sri Lankan government understands that they need to look beyond this military victory, which goes back to that earlier point, which is that you might have defeated the LTT, but is the Tamil problem going to get solved? Maybe not. As for the military things, maybe you will have something to say, sir.
Exactly, absolutely correct regarding the need for a political solution to this particular problem. Militarily, as an aspect that I can only say that it will not give any solutions. The terrain, we've already burnt our fingers by going to that area. I don't think there should be any cause or any reason why we should again go out there. The only thing is that somehow the pressure has to be through the political spheres on ensuring that the Sri Lankan government understands the gravity of it. Whether the Norwegians did their bit, I'm doubtful on that particular count. But by virtue of the fact that they are in our particular area of sphere of influence and domain, we have to be much more proactive on that count. And I would not like, as a military man, to divert my attention from the north, coming down to the south, and then subsequently getting involved in something which is a prolonged affair. I think it was very well covered by you about the political aspects.
Yes. I think that's the sort of right approach to take it.
Dr. Brigaspati.
Yeah, of late, we are, our government is, it gives the impression that government is not following independent foreign policy, and it's all their actions are more towards, tilting towards US. It was evident when India voted against Iran in the UN Assembly, and also the enthusiasm shown by US government in signing US nuclear deal more than India itself. It all gives the impression that India is not an independent country. It's not a sovereign. It is being dictated by some other foreign power. What's your view?
I mean, the sort of idea of an independent or strategic independence or independent foreign policy is always a sort of an amorphous concept, because it is independence vis-a-vis what? No country in this world which wishes to have foreign policy with others can operate on the assumption that they can do whatever it is that they want. Principally because you will always have to react to what others are doing as well. So it is a strategic aspect of that interaction which always makes it clear that whatever choices you make will always be dependent on what choices others are making. So I'm not so sure that independence can be sort of, you can put a chart saying, okay, during this period we were so independent, during this period we were not. Having said that, yes, there is a growing convergence of, move towards the United States. On the Indo-US nuclear deal, there has been a lot of public debate, there's both for and against in terms of what needs to be done and so on. But you're right, the larger problem is that it's not just of, if I may rephrase what you're trying to say, is of, are we adopting the American worldview? Are we buying into the American way of looking at the way the world works and the way that we need to work? Are we, for instance, buying into American view of how weapons proliferation should be controlled? Are we buying into their worldview about how terrorism needs to be combated? Clearly, those worldviews are very different from what we as a country believe. I mean, the way that India has to combat terrorism is in many ways very different from the way the Americans have to combat, because we are combating on our territory, and we have multivariates. We have a number of sources from which we face problems. The Americans, on the other hand, their combat against terrorism is happening in different areas. It's happening with different intensities. So the important thing will always be for us to understand how much of the other person's worldview we are buying into, because that is what will ultimately result in whether there is a convergence in terms of strategic views or not. As far as the Iran vote is concerned, yes, you can, on the one hand, we can say that yes, India voted against Iran in order to please the United States. But the pleasing of the United States was not an end in itself. It was part of a larger agreement in order to get us a particular status so that we can get nuclear technology and so on from there. So to that extent, I think it will always be calculations of what serves your interest rather than who's your friend or who's your buddy. So.
Okay, I think the last final short question from Dr. Saikawa.
Thank you for the excellent analysis of what the challenges political leadership in time of war. But going through your analysis, case studies, and also the discussion we had, brings to the point that you said the purpose of the war is to achieve political goals. So obviously, the decision for a war will be taken by the politicians. And nowhere we are seeing the training or the leadership. Nowhere. I mean, the political leadership is nowhere near to getting anywhere strategized into this. And added to that, the developed countries, not only in India, developed countries, they have faction leaders having very limited purpose for which they are into the politics. So that I see a contradiction in the sense that we need these qualities, which you very nicely listed, but nowhere near that people like to do the same. So what will happen? But one more question is that while we understand that the bitterness in Pakistan, we can understand. But what is the bitterness in Bangladesh?
Yeah, the first question, you're absolutely right. All of the case studies which I showed were premised on the assumption that these people took a great degree of interest in what is happening militarily. As one of the earlier questions pointed out, it was not that these people were trying to sort of manage local ground level actions, but what they understood was what was happening. Because you need to have a clear picture of what's happening, and for that you need to know what's the military instrument which is at your hand. So you need to know what its qualities are, so that you can then decide whether it is actually achievable. It's all very good to say that, okay, I have X amount of troops and this is my political objective, so I need to use it. But it might always be the case that the instrument is not fitted to the objective, or the objective cannot be attained at a reasonable cost to us. So all of this means that you need to understand the character of the instrument. I think this Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw who said that Indian politicians cannot even distinguish between a mortar and a mortar, or a gorilla and a gorilla. And he said this in a public forum, which is very true, and that reflects poorly on the people who are coming to leadership positions, because it shows that they're not taking their job seriously, and that is what. See, Jawaharlal Nehru might not have been a successful military leader, but he took a great deal of interest in understanding what military history was. He might have got his decisions wrong, but he still knew, he was interested, he would ask, he would read. How many Indian leaders that can be said today, I will not comment on that, but you are absolutely right that a willingness to get into these things is very important. Abraham Lincoln did not have any background when he came to this, but once he was there, he would order volumes from the Library of Congress in order to read, understand what has happened. So that is the sort of effort which the more successful leaders put into understanding what has happened. Whether our leadership will do that or not is a question which we can only subsequently answer. The other question was about Bangladesh.
What went wrong with them?
What went wrong with Bangladesh? That's a very long story, but yeah, I think it's once again an instance of our being unable to manage the post-war transition in Bangladesh, because the initial government led by Mujibur Rahman and the Awami League was quite well disposed, but then that government was overthrown, Mujib was assassinated. So the cycle now seems to have come to a full circle. Mujib's daughter is back with a huge mandate, so possibly this is a time when we can think about renewing the sort of good relationships.
I think Dr. Narayan has a question, so we don't want to prevent that.
Based on your examples that you quoted at the discussions, I get an impression that event-based leadership is important. because of all the three leaders, apart from Lincoln, the two are having a lot of decisions which are not good. If we consider Indira Gandhi, it is well known that people accept now that she is the person who has led to our situation of corruption and dynastic rule. Similarly, I would say that Jawaharlal Nehru also, though not directly but indirectly, he has also started this, and he led us to a war which was a very bad outcome. Then are we supposed to limit leadership only to some events, or it should take care of the long-term role also?
I think that needs a long answer, so I'm requesting Dr. Srinath to talk to you during lunch. That's okay. May I now request Dr. Anuradha Reddy for the closing comments and a formal vote of thanks to Dr. Srinath Raghavan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Srinath. That was an extremely inciting talk. 60 minutes, and we navigated through 3 continents, 3 major crisis situations, and practically everybody had a question to ask, and they were answered, so I'll not intervene too much. I only want to say that a crisis situation is to be assessed as a process of decision making. So we look at it in the larger context of a decision making process, and he summed it up beautifully with the bulleted points which indicated when leadership is strategizing, what are the issues that are to be taken into consideration. This could extend to other decision making processes also, not necessarily crisis situation. That is what leadership is all about. I will not take up time. Thank you so much, Srinath, for this lecture. And on behalf of all my course mates here, the faculty of NIAS, and ladies and gentlemen who are present here, I would say a very big thank you and probably present a memento on